Welcome to Antiques Masterclass. Today we have Sam Loxton from Lucas Rarities who's going to talk about Art Deco jewellery. Sam, thank you so much for coming along today.
Pleasure.
It's fascinating. So a lot of people will not know about Art Deco. They know about Art Deco a little bit, but what is Art Deco basically?
There's quite a lot of misconception with Art Deco. If you look here, the V&A do a definition that refers to the 1920s through to the Depression of the 30s. Interestingly, it really began at the turn of the century. The earliest movement was created in France and began in about 1901, a collection of French artists led by Eugene Grasset, who got together, and Grasset published a book in 1906 which differentiated between the swirls and curls of the Art Nouveau movement with the lines and linear design that we associate now with Art Deco. This exposition in Paris in 1925 is what most people will refer to as the birth of Art Deco. It should originally have been in 1906, but for the reason of this French group of artists disbanded in 1905, it was delayed. It was then supposed to take place in 1914, but obviously with the social and political way of the world, it was cancelled again and delayed until 1925. This is a scene from the inside of the Art Deco exhibition, and what was interesting here is the jewellers exhibited in vitrines and showcases, but none of them were labelled. So it wasn't a publicity stunt. You didn't go looking for a particular manufacturer, you were enjoying the beauty of what was on display, not knowing who had actually created it.
So it's a juxtaposed from sort of the Art Nouveau, which is all flow and everything else, and whereas the Art Deco is a lot
more linear, strong design. Yeah. The term was really coined by Bevis Hillier in his book from the 50s, who was an English art historian. But even then he admits that it had been used in the trade since the 30s. There's arguments today that talk of rebranding the term to be specific to pieces made in France in the 20s and 30s, not counting American Art Deco or Deco pieces produced from any country other than France. But Deco itself, it is a misconception. It should really start from much earlier. Chrysler Building was started in 1928. These are the stereotypical images that people have, and that's where this slight misunderstanding, I think, comes from. This is Eugene Grasset, who wrote the book, and was one of the foremost fathers of the Deco movement. And we see here, this is Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, which was influential in the growth of Art Deco before the 1920s. This came to Paris in 1908 and brought with it the Eastern influence that we associate with Art Deco, especially in jewellery, but in other media as well. And it was very influential for a designer called Paul Laribe, who we'll come on to shortly, who first started his career working at Cartier as an apprentice.
Is he one of the driving forces of Art Deco?
He is. He really took Deco from its infancy through to the 1920s boom and the 30s depression. His first break, if you like, was illustrating this book for Paul Poiret. And he was a graphic designer, I suppose you'd say, by trade, but went on to cover every single discipline. He made furniture such as this, and here you can see the Art Nouveau influence, but branching into the stronger design and colours of the Deco period. Very, very collectible.
Absolutely beautiful.
A chair like this sold in New York, I think 2 years ago, for $750,000. And these are some of his jewellery designs. He put this collection together in 1911. He was asked to do so by a silversmith called Robert Linsler, who saw his creative genius and thought it would be nice to put it into jewellery as well as the furniture, etc. that he did.
What is this?
That's a headpiece. Most of the pieces in the collection were actually headpieces, aigrettes, tiaras. There was a few earrings and pendants. Going back to his talent, this is Iribe's advertising campaign for Nicolas, the wine merchant.
Still
who's still around, yeah. And he did a whole marketing campaign for them, designing all of these images.
He's a multi-talented guy then. So
He was.
Proper design, moving the whole, as you say, moving the whole influence forward.
He was very, very influential, but sickeningly talented, I think is a nice way of saying it. This is the 1923 film, The Meal, the Ten Commandments, and the whole film set and costumes were designed by Paul Leribe. He moved to America after the First World War and got involved with Hollywood. Again, the influence of the East and the Orient and the influence of the East and the Orient and the development and discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, it was all influential in the Deco designs, with the revival of Egyptian revival.
There was so much news about that Tutankhamun thing as well. So.
Well, it happened at the right time. There was an increase in the availability of travel. People could afford to take a cruise, go and see it firsthand, and the excitement was growing. These are some more of his costumes, which were from a slightly earlier period.
But by doing this is stunning.
Sorry, I've blown you away with the shot.
No, that's absolutely stunning.
This was the centrepiece of his exhibition well, I won't tell you the date. This is an interesting one. If I were to give that piece to you and ask you perhaps to suggest when it was made, you'd be forgiven for saying
1922, 1925. Yeah, that's what. As an auctioneer, I'd say that as well.
This was actually made in 1911. And this, to me, is the first great piece of Art Deco jewellery. Has all of the elements.
And how much? I mean, what would that be worth to this day's market?
Today's market, to a collector,
if it was available,
over 7 figures.
Wow,
it's that important. But you see, this carved piece by Cartier wasn't made until the 1920s, when they started to move into their tutti frutti.
Yeah.
Jacques Cartier went to the Far East and Egypt in 1912, something like that, but it took 10 years for them to really get production going. And this was 10 years previous. And it has all the elements, has the carved emerald with the Indian influence, the starburst design. It's a headpiece. And actually Paul Leribe gave it to his wife, Jeanne de Ris, and this is the original drawing from the exhibition. But his wife tended to wear it here as a large stomacher brooch. And interestingly, he gave it to his wife before they were married. They married in 1911, and in the back of a biography of Leribe, it's listed as belonging to her personally, as opposed to a gift from him. Tragically, they divorced later, 1919, and the brooch disappeared until it reappeared in Cartier's London vaults in 1932. It was then sold and disappeared for a further 70, 80 years, until it was discovered in a small auction house.
Really? So what, she might have sold it back to Cartier?
I think so. I think because Leribe worked for Cartier, did a sort of apprenticeship with him in the early 1900s, I'd like to think the stone came through their hands. Otherwise, I can't see how he could have acquired such an important emerald for the brooch. And then she completed the circle by returning it to them. Cartier were a driving force in the 20s and 30s of something of this importance needed to go to a good home, and that's where it ended up. Here she is in a cartoon. It was obviously a very well-loved piece of hers. She's always illustrated and photographed wearing it. This is an artist's impression of it when they were at the theatre in Paris. But you see, Cartier took the tutti frutti to another level. I mean, this is typical Deco, but from the 30s. So it just emphasises the fact that Leribe was, like all great artists, ahead of his time by years and years.
But then it did die out at the end of the 30s, isn't it, with the crash? And
it was tailing off. The influence was still felt through, but the actual original, if you like, Deco movement certainly tailed off with the advent of the Second World War. This is Tutankhamun, Pompeii, the lost cities of Troy, all driving the interest, the social interest, which these purchasers of the 20s and 30s had in current events.
And it's amazing. It's amazing. It's amazing that his designs created the designs for all the clothing as well, and that sort of influence as well.
That's right.
He drove all of that.
I guess to his advantage, he was doing the design for the costumes for the big Hollywood productions at the time.
And
He was
fashions-
invited to all of the
fashions kicked
fashion
up from there,
parties,
yeah.
and he could link the two together.
Was he super? I mean, was he super wealthy because of his designs? And
I'm not quite sure how wealthy he was, but interestingly, he actually ended up in 1928 with Coco Chanel. And she designed her first ever real fine jewellery exhibition in 1932, to which Aribe had a huge part. He and Chanel were engaged, and tragically he died in 1935 on her tennis court in France.
How old?
He was born in 1883, so early 50s.
Yeah.
And tragic because had he survived the Second World War, I think more people would know of him. He'd have gone on to bigger and better things and be a household name. Interestingly, in this book, Schwa, which he wrote towards the end of the 20s, 1929, there's an illustration. There are several acetate plates in there, one of which is for this necklace. So there's no doubt that he helped Chanel design the whole exhibition, which...
Well, it definitely got on because both into jewellery, both into
That's
design,
right.
So
and he, I think, forced her hand into designing this fine jewellery. She'd always said that diamonds were a frivolous waste of money, and I think he had quite a lot of influence over her and said, actually, and I believe that the other reason for the exhibition was that the diamonds used in the jewellery were provided by De Beers as something of an advertising campaign for them.
Yeah.
The Depression of the 30s, they wanted to launch their commodity, if you will, and the exhibition received a huge amount of attention, obviously being Chanel.
So, I mean, apart from the stereotypical images of Art Deco design, were there any other approaches?
There were quite a few which ran concurrently. This brooch by Chanel is typical. It's the starburst, it's straight lines, and...
Because people know Chanel in this day and age as perfume rather than jewellery.
And maybe clothing.
And clothing, obviously. Yes, as well, yeah.
But I believe today they are doing some jewellery, whether it's fine jewellery or costume jewellery, I'm not sure. But Chanel herself was a huge fan of jewellery. She bought from Verdura, she bought from Cartier, so she had quite a nice collection of her own.
Absolutely amazing.
But in terms of other approaches, these are stereotypical, I suppose, images of deco jewellery. The black and the white, the chandelier earrings, the Egyptian revival bangles, the use of strong black, red, black, blue colours.
Big contrasting colours that they used then.
And bold colours. But this was the more subtle approach, I suppose. At the same time, there were pieces such as this, which was made by a house called René Boivin.
Wow.
Completely different. Still has elements, but the form, unfortunately the photograph doesn't give the depth of the piece justice.
How big is it? Is it quite...
It's about so big, and has a real shape to it. When worn, it's beautiful. So, René Boivin...
So it was about sort of this big?
No. Sort of maybe an inch and a half tall. But
Platinum and
diamonds. But you can't see the swirl, if you like, the circular nature of it. And it was made by René Boivin, the House of Boivin. René died in 1918, along with his son. And the company was continued by his widow, Madame Boivin, who interestingly was Paul Poiret's sister. And if you remember, Paul Poiret was the chap that gave Paul Aribe his first break with the illustration of the book. It was rather an incestuous world, these creative minds getting together. So Madame Boivin took the company on and started creating the most phenomenal jewellery in the 20s and 30s with the assistance of another great designer, Suzanne Belperon, who started work in 1920 as a junior, if you like, and went on to set up her own business as well. But the jewellery they produced was deco, but not. Some of the colours they used, this bangle...
A bit more subtle rather than bright.
I'd actually say the other way.
Oh, really?
I'd say much bolder.
Okay.
Different form, different shape, lots of circular movement. This bangle was made by Boivin, designed by Suzanne Belperon in 1922, but it's silver. set with citrine, semi-precious stones in a metal that isn't normally used for fine jewellery. It was more about the aesthetic than the intrinsic value of how many diamonds, whether it's platinum, all very well made. And the beauty of Boivin and Belbron's jewellery, and one of the giveaways, because neither ever signed any of their work, is the scale of proportion. It might look big in the hand, and you say, oh, this is too much, it's over the top. But once it's on, they fitted their customers like dressmakers. Everything was done to exact measurements and proportions.
And they didn't sign their pieces, so you literally you have to look at their piece, see the quality of the work, and you just know.
There's a certain Belbron's famous for saying, my style is my signature. To those who understand and know her work, you can spot it a mile away. Recently it's become much more collectible. There was a big sale 2 years ago in Geneva of her personal jewellery, and a book has just been written about it. Another book is to be launched next year. And she was probably the greatest designer of the 20th century, in my mind, for jewellery. She worked on her own. She finished at Boivin and went to work with Monsieur Hertz, who was a fine stone dealer in Paris at the time. Unfortunately, he died during the war. His son was in a prisoner of war camp, and after the war they reunited the business. But she was designing jewellery 40, 50 years ahead of her time. If you opened a shop today and put some of these pieces in the window, people would think it was contemporary. And she had a great following amongst the wealthy of the world at the time. She was forever in Vogue and advertising in glossy magazines. But she designed pieces like this, which is purely a silver necklace, has no intrinsic value, but purely a piece of art. It should really be seen as such, rather than a commodity.
They're just one-off pieces as well.
Every piece is unique.
Yeah.
She never made anything. If my wife's at a dinner party with your wife and says, I love your ring, Madame Belbron, I've seen Addison's wife with this ring, I'd like the same one. It would have a twist to it. It wouldn't be an exact replica.
Would all her jewellery be bespoke jewellery? I mean, like she
I think a lot of it was
made for her clients.
It was definitely made for her clients. It was made to order. She had a first floor salon. She was very interested into the interaction with her client. Literally, she'd fit them as a dressmaker would make a dress. She'd also take old stones from the client and remodel them to a 1930s, 40s design, which, if you inherited your grandmother's jewels in 1935 and you didn't like the Victorian heavy silver yellow gold feel, she'd take the pieces and redo them.